They say airports reveal who we really are, not when we take off, but when we're forced to wait. That morning, Atlanta International Airport buzzed like a beehive. Screens blinked, announcements echoed, and people in suits rushed past, like they were late for something that could save the world. I stood among them, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, another tired millionaire pretending that everything urgent mattered. I wasn't supposed to be here emotionally, just physically. My mind was already in Seattle, at a board meeting that had lost its meaning months ago. Success, it turns out, makes you efficient at running away from yourself. Then I saw him. He was maybe 20, tall but thin, wearing a grey hoodie and carrying an old guitar case covered with stickers from places he'd probably never been paid to play in. He stood at the check-in counter, explaining something to the gate agent. I couldn't hear his words, but I could feel his tone, polite, restrained, tired. The gate agent frowned. "Sir, I told you, this ID doesn't match your ticket." "It does," he said, voice soft but steady. "I just renewed my license. The photo looks different, that's all." The line behind him shifted. People sighed loudly, exaggeratedly, the universal language of irritation. A woman muttered, "Always something," and the man behind her laughed quietly. I should have looked away, but I didn't. There was something in the young man's face. Not defiance, not anger, just a kind of silent endurance that felt older than he was. The kind you learn only after too many moments like this. The gate agent picked up the phone. A few minutes later, 2 airport police officers walked over. One older, one young, both white, both moving with the calm confidence of men used to being obeyed. "Sir, we'll need to see your identification again," the older officer said. The young man nodded. "Of course." He handed over his ID and ticket. His fingers shook slightly, but his voice didn't. "I'm a musician. I'm flying to Seattle for a show." The officer didn't look at the ticket. "Step aside, please." I saw his throat tighten, his lips part, a protest swallowed before it could be born. He stepped aside. People in line pretended to check their phones. The gate agent avoided his eyes. The silence around him was the kind that screams. The officer's tone hardened. "Open your guitar case." The young man blinked. "Why?" "Security check." I don't know what made me step forward. Maybe guilt. Maybe recognition. Maybe both. "Excuse me," I said. "What's going on?" The officer turned toward me, expression sharp. "Sir, this doesn't concern you, doesn't it?" I asked. "He's standing quietly with a guitar, and you're treating him like a threat." The officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, please return to your area." The young man looked at me, wary, grateful, scared. "It's okay," he murmured. "They always say it's just a routine check." He opened the case. Inside was a beaten-up Gibson, strings missing, edges scuffed. Nothing dangerous, just a story carved into wood. The older officer stared at it for a moment, then grunted. "You're free to go." "Thanks," the young man said quietly, "for letting me keep my dignity." He walked toward gate 47, guitar case in hand, and I stood there, still holding my coffee, realizing it had gone cold, like something inside me had too. I couldn't walk away. Even after the crowd moved on and the noise of the terminal swallowed the moment, I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, my heart hammering like I'd just been caught doing something wrong. The young man, I'd later learn his name was Miles, had disappeared into the sea of passengers. The officers were still at the counter, laughing quietly with the gate agent. From a distance, it looked like nothing had happened at all, but I couldn't unsee it. I wandered toward my gate, the announcement board flashing, "Seattle on time." The words mocked me somehow. Everything about my world was always on time. The flights, the meetings, the profits. But morality never seemed to run on the same schedule. At a nearby coffee stand, I caught sight of one of the officers, the younger one. He looked uneasy, his hand wrapped around a paper cup, eyes distant. For a moment, he didn't look like a man in uniform. He just looked human. I walked over. "Rough morning?" I asked. He turned sharply. "Excuse me?" I saw what happened back there. His jaw tightened. "Protocol, sir. We were called to assist." "Assist," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling humiliation these days?" He didn't answer. The muscles in his neck twitched. For a moment I thought he'd walk away, but he didn't. "You think I wanted to do that?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. "Did you?" He looked down. "Doesn't matter what I want. You follow orders. You don't ask questions." "Maybe that's the problem," I said. He gave a hollow laugh. "Easy to say when you're not the one wearing the badge. He was right, of course. My privilege was invisible until it wasn't. I could challenge injustice without fear of losing my job, or my safety, or my life. For him, defiance came with a price tag. Before I could reply, the intercom crackled. Final boarding call for Flight 246 to Seattle. I nodded toward him. You ever wonder if maybe following orders too long makes you forget who you are? He didn't look up, but I saw his hand tremble slightly around the cup. I boarded the plane. The flight felt longer than usual. Outside the window, clouds stretched like endless walls, soft but impenetrable. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the guitar case opening, the crowd's silence, the officer's voice, mine too late. When we landed, I walked through the terminal in a fog. My assistant had texted a dozen times about meetings. I ignored them all. Instead, I found myself searching for him. The musician. It was ridiculous. Airports were oceans. People vanished in them. Still, I scanned the baggage claim, the cafes, the taxi line. And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. Music. A faint, imperfect melody floated through the hall. A guitar, slightly out of tune but achingly alive. I followed the sound to an empty corner near Gate 12. There he was. Miles. Sitting on the floor, guitar case open, playing like the world wasn't watching. I stood there, listening. The notes weren't smooth. They were raw, cracked, human. Every chord felt like an apology I hadn't said. When he finished, I dropped a 20 into the case. He looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. You didn't have to, he said. I know, I replied, but I should have. He smiled faintly. Most people don't even look. I'm starting to, I said, and for the first time in years, I meant it. I didn't think I'd see him again, but a few days later, I got a call from airport security. Sir, this is Officer Thomas Rivera. We spoke at the terminal last week. The voice on the line was steady but strained. I was hoping we could meet, off duty, just to talk. For a moment I thought about saying no, but something in his tone, quiet, uncertain, sounded less like a request and more like a confession waiting to happen. We met the next morning at a diner near the airport, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion. He sat in a corner booth, uniform jacket folded beside him. Without it, he looked younger and more fragile. Appreciate you coming, he said. Didn't know who else to talk to, I nodded. You're the one who called me. What's on your mind? He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. That kid, the one with the guitar. I can't stop thinking about it. The look on his face, like he expected it, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. He paused, staring out the window at the morning traffic. You know what that does to a man. Realizing someone's pain is part of your routine. I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the only honest answer. I joined the force to help people, he continued. But lately, it feels like all I do is scare them. Half the time, I can't tell if I'm enforcing safety or prejudice. His voice cracked slightly. And that's not what I signed up for. I studied him. The way his hands fidgeted, the faint bruise-colored circles under his eyes. He wasn't looking for pity. He was searching for permission. Permission to feel human again. You know, I said quietly, I used to think silence was neutral. I'd see something wrong and tell myself it wasn't my place. But that day at the airport, I realized silence is a choice. It protects the wrong people. He nodded slowly. Yeah, feels like we both chose wrong that day. Maybe, I said. But maybe that means we can choose better next time. He gave a bitter laugh. You think people like us get next times? I thought about Miles. His calm, his music, the way he'd walked away without looking back. I think forgiveness isn't something you wait for, I said. It's something you build, one act at a time. We sat there for a while, not talking. The waitress refilled our coffees, and outside, planes rumbled overhead. Distant, constant, indifferent. Finally, Rivera reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a folded note. He slid it across the table. He left this at the terminal, he said. That kid found it while we were doing cleanup. Figured it was a lyric sheet or something. I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but hurried. For the ones who watch but still choose to see. For the ones who keep quiet until they find their voice. May your silence turn into something louder than hate. I stared at the words until they blurred. Rivera looked at me. I'm not sure what to do with that. Maybe start by listening, I said. Then keep going. He nodded, eyes wet but steady. Yeah, maybe I will. When I left the diner, the morning sun was harsh and bright. I watched the contrails of a plane fade slowly into the sky, thinking about how everything we do, every word, every silence, leaves a trail behind. And maybe, just maybe, it was time mine started leading somewhere different. A week passed, but the words on that folded note wouldn't leave me. May your silence turn into something louder than hate. They echoed in every meeting, every elevator ride, every polite conversation I had with people who thought diversity was a brand strategy, not a moral one. By Thursday, I found myself driving back to Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, not because I had a flight, but because I needed to see where it all began. The place looked the same, sterile, humming, impatient. But I wasn't the same man who had stood there with a cup of coffee and an expensive suit pretending not to care. I found Rivera near the TSA checkpoint, out of uniform this time, talking to a supervisor. He looked more at ease, almost lighter. When he saw me, he smiled, small, cautious, real. Didn't think I'd see you again, he said. I'm not sure I did either, I replied. We walked to a quiet corner near the observation windows, where you could watch the planes rise into the clouds. Rivera pulled something from his jacket, a worn badge. He turned it over in his hand, the metal catching the light. I turned it in, he said. I blinked. You quit, he nodded. Didn't feel like protecting anything anymore, at least not the way they told me to. Was it worth it? I asked. He thought for a long moment before answering. Ask me again when I can breathe without guilt. We both laughed softly, the kind that hurts a little because it's true. Then he said, I've been trying to find that kid, Miles. No one at the airline has contact info. You ever try? I hesitated. I did, once, but he vanished into the noise. Rivera sighed. Maybe that's what happens to people like him. They keep disappearing until someone decides to look harder. That hit harder than I expected. I opened my phone and pulled up an email I'd written the night before, but hadn't sent. It was addressed to the airport's PR office, the police liaison, and half a dozen people in management. The subject line read, Incident at Gate 47, and what comes next. Without overthinking it, I pressed send. Rivera raised an eyebrow. What was that? A start, I said. The next few weeks blurred into something different from the life I knew. The story of the discrimination at Gate 47 began spreading, quietly at first, then faster. Someone had filmed it, and the video surfaced online. Comments flooded in. Some defended the officers, some condemned them, but most, surprisingly, asked the same question. What are we doing to stop this from happening again? The airport released a statement, typical PR fluff. But this time, I didn't settle for silence. I reached out to the city council, the airlines board, anyone who'd listen. I used my influence, not for leverage, but for truth. 2 months later, they implemented a new bias and dignity training program, co-led by a former officer named Thomas Rivera. When he called to tell me, his voice cracked. Guess we both did something louder than hate, he said. I looked out my office window, watching a plane take off against the late afternoon sky. Maybe we had. Because change doesn't start with heroes. It starts with ordinary people who finally decide to stop being comfortable. And somewhere out there, I hoped Miles was still playing his guitar, maybe even writing a song about the day the silence broke. 6 months later, I was back in Atlanta, standing in the same terminal where everything had started. Different flight, different purpose, but the same smell of jet fuel, coffee, and human impatience. A lot had changed since that day at Gate 47. Rivera had resigned from the force, though he now worked with a non-profit teaching de-escalation and bias awareness to police cadets. We still talk sometimes. Two unlikely friends bound by guilt and the strange kind of courage that follows it. As for me, I'd stopped measuring my worth by flight miles and bank balances. My company still ran fine without me there every day. The truth was, I'd started showing up for something else. Conversations that mattered, people who didn't have microphones, stories that needed to be told. Still, I kept thinking about Miles. I never learned his last name. I'd tried searching for him, old flight records, social media, anything. Nothing. Sometimes I wondered if he'd been real at all, or just a mirror that life held up when it was tired of your excuses. Then, one rainy afternoon in June, I got an email from Rivera. Subject: You should see this. Attached was a link to a local news article. Atlanta street musician goes viral for song about airport incident. The photo hit me like a punch to the chest. It was him, Miles, sitting on a folding stool outside Concourse D, guitar balanced on his knee, singing into a cheap microphone. His eyes were closed, his face calm. The same stillness that had once looked like fear now looked like peace. I turned up the video. The song began soft, almost a whisper. The lyrics told a story about a morning flight, a crowd that wouldn't meet your eyes, a man who found his voice too late. The refrain was haunting. Somewhere between takeoff and truth, a silence breaks like glass. And maybe that's how change begins. My throat tightened. The camera panned over his guitar case open in front of him. Inside, someone had placed a folded note and a single airport badge, Rivera's badge. I called him immediately. "You saw it," he said before I could speak. His voice was steady, almost proud. "I left it there last week. Figured he'd know what it meant." "What did it mean?" I asked. "That we finally listened," he said simply. I watched the video again that night, over and over. The more I listened, the more I realized the song wasn't just about him. It was about all of us. Every person who'd ever looked away. Every officer who'd hidden behind protocol. Every man who thought silence was safety. The next morning, I went to the airport myself. The same terminal, the same hum of humanity. And there he was, Miles, playing near the escalators, eyes closed, completely lost in the music. I waited until he finished. He opened his eyes and smiled faintly when he saw me. "Didn't think you'd still be flying," he said. "I'm not," I replied. "Just learning how to land," he laughed softly. "That's harder than it looks." "Yeah," I said, "but you make it sound easy." I dropped a small envelope into his guitar case. Inside was my business card, folded around a short note. "Keep playing. The world needs to hear you." Then I walked away before he could say anything. As I reached the gate, I heard him start another song, the melody rising above the announcements, the footsteps, the noise of ordinary life, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from my silence. I was walking with it, and finally, it was singing back. A year has passed since that morning at the airport. Sometimes, I still hear the announcement chime in my dreams. Flight 246 to Seattle, now boarding at gate 47. It doesn't wake me anymore. It reminds me the world hasn't changed overnight. Airports still hum with impatience. People still carry their quiet prejudices through security like hidden luggage. But sometimes I see something different. A moment of pause, an act of awareness, a face turned toward empathy instead of away from it. And I realize change doesn't roar, it hums. Rivera now leads workshops across the country, speaking to recruits about dignity, perception, and restraint. He still calls sometimes, always from a different city. He jokes that he's learning to travel without armor. "Funny thing," he said once, "when you stop seeing everyone as a potential threat, the world gets a lot bigger." As for me, I've stepped back from the company almost completely. My partners call it an early retirement. I call it recovery. I spend more time writing, less time selling. Sometimes I visit high schools to talk about leadership. Not the corporate kind, but the human kind. The kind that starts when you stop being afraid of being wrong. And then there's Miles. He never chased fame, but fame found him anyway. His song, Takeoff and Truth, became something of a quiet anthem. Not the kind that trends, but the kind that lingers. It plays in coffee shops, in online clips, sometimes even in airport terminals. People hum along without knowing its origin. That's the beauty of art. It slips past the noise and finds its way into people who need it. Last month, I ran into him again by accident. I was in Nashville, visiting a community center that hosted a youth music program. He was teaching a class, not performing, just guiding a group of teenagers through chords and rhythm. He looked up, smiled, and said, "You finally caught the right flight." We talked after the session. He told me he'd started a foundation for young musicians from underrepresented backgrounds, a place for kids who needed to be heard. He called it the Gate 47 Project. "I wanted to name it after where it started," he said. "Pain can be an origin story too, if you let it." That night, I sat in the back of the small auditorium as he played a new song. It wasn't polished. It didn't have the haunting melancholy of the first one, but it was alive, filled with hope, forgiveness, something like peace. The lyrics stayed with me. Every silence has a sound. Every fall can still be flight, if you learn to listen long enough to what's been waiting in the quiet. When the song ended, no one clapped right away. It was the kind of silence that felt sacred, and for once, I wasn't afraid of it. Later, walking through the empty streets, I looked up and saw a plane crossing the night sky. A streak of silver against the dark. For the first time, it didn't look like escape. It looked like connection. A bridge between stories, between strangers, between who we were and who we could still become. I thought about all the gates I'd passed through in my life. Some literal, some morale, and how sometimes redemption isn't about flying higher. It's about landing honestly. And maybe that's what Miles taught me, that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the beginning of a song, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. 3 years later, I found myself back in Atlanta, walking through the same terminal where everything had once unraveled. The airport hadn't changed. The same polished floors, the same announcements echoing through the high ceilings, the same blur of faces moving in practiced rhythm. But I wasn't here to fly. Not anymore. I'd stopped chasing destinations. Now I came to airports for the strange comfort of watching people leave and return. Proof that movement didn't always mean escape. I stopped near Gate 47. The number still carried weight. Though the world around it had long forgotten, there was a new coffee kiosk where the counter used to be, and the gate agent looked far too young to remember the morning a young black musician was stopped and questioned for the crime of existing. I stood there for a while, letting the past and present overlap. Then I noticed something. A small framed photograph hanging near the corner of the gate. I almost missed it. The picture showed a group of teenagers standing on a small stage, holding guitars, smiling. Beneath it was a plaque. The Gate 47 Project, founded by musician Miles Carter to promote empathy, equality, and creative expression for young artists across America. My chest tightened. Miles Carter. I'd never known his last name until now. I read the inscription again, slower this time, and then I saw a smaller plaque beneath it, almost hidden, as if humility itself had placed it there, in honor of all who chose to see. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The crowd around me shifted, people rushing to board, others saying tearful goodbyes. And there I was, standing in the middle of it all, holding a memory that had become something larger than guilt. A soft guitar note drifted through the air. I turned and saw a young woman, maybe 17, sitting near the window, playing quietly. Her music wasn't perfect, but it was full of something real. People slowed down as they passed. A few smiled. One child stopped to listen. When she finished, I walked over and dropped a folded note into her open guitar case. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Keep playing," I told her. "It matters more than you think." As I walked away, I heard her start another song. Gentle, uncertain, beautiful. It carried through the concourse, blending with the hum of engines and the murmur of travelers. I found a seat near the window and watched the planes taxi across the runway, their lights blinking like distant constellations. I thought about Rivera, still teaching, still trying, and Miles, who had turned pain into art and art into healing. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the note I'd kept all these years. The one Rivera had given me back at that diner. The paper was soft with time, the ink faded, but the words still clear. May your silence turn into something louder than hate. Outside, a jet lifted into the night sky, engines roaring, not as noise, but as testimony, and I realized, for the first time in my life, that the world hadn't become kinder by accident. It had changed because somewhere, someone decided to see. I stood, tucked the note into my jacket, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the girl's music rose again, light and fearless, filling Gate 47 with something that had once been missing, the sound of silence finally learning how to sing.